Good afternoon and welcome to Gript's live stream. This is a new format we're trying out. We're going live on YouTube, Twitch, X, Instagram, and Facebook. It's going to be myself, Gary Kavanagh, and my colleague, Fatima. We're going to be walking through a couple of the stories of the week, basically keeping you up to date with them. We will also be having kind of a back and forth, a bit of a Q&A, so if people want to leave comments or the like, we can pull those up and we can discuss them. But basically, we're just going to do this as a very quick kind of news roundup or stuff that we found interesting over the kind of lunch break that people can kind of drop in and drop out of. We'll see if it works. If it works, we'll do more of them. If people like them, we'll do more of them. So feel free to send in any comments or suggestions as to what we should be doing. We'd love to hear from you. Fatima, how have you been?
I've been busy. I think busy is the easiest word to use, but in a very good way and a very productive way and a satisfying way.
Yeah, we've got you down the courts now. How are you finding the chaos?
I don't know. I think I'm quite used to it in a way. Just from personal experience of the civil courts when I was young. Yeah, no, I feel quite comfortable in a court scenario. You know, like my having I suppose lived in Japan, I'm very familiar with the strictly enforced etiquette and the how you're supposed to be respectful and shut up and all of that stuff comes very naturally to me, I would say. So I don't find it jarring at all. I feel quite comfortable.
Have you gone into any of the district courts and seen the absolute circus that they are?
I have. I was briefly in Dublin District Court last week, and I was struck by, I suppose, particularly how sad outcomes for, in particular, young men who abuse drugs are. You know, I saw like this one guy who was, like he was. I'm sure he would be like a lovely looking 20 something year old, 22, 23, and he was just absolutely pickled with drugs. You know, had 77 convictions possibly accrued in a very short space of time, and you just, I suppose, you're kind of confronted with the reality of what drugs do to a person's life. And I think that's a chronic issue, particularly in inner city Dublin, and one that hasn't been addressed.
This starting said that we should be called the week that really wasn't. You were very fast off the mark. And thank you to Rose Waters for saying that they've missed hearing my voice. Hopefully, I will be doing more of these and you will get to hear more of it. And Eamon, when you ask why we're called Gript Media, because it was a committee decision and I couldn't convince them it was a terrible name. I tried my best, but in the end, I was outvoted. And so that is now the name. And that is the truth of it. But to start into the actual stories, I think we're going to go through what's happened with Le Pen, what we've seen in the EU, with the EU Commission having to admit that they were improperly funding environmental NGOs. But I wanted to start with a piece of work I did. The joy of being the presenter is you get to put your own work out there. And I did a review of the last 21 years of crime data in Dublin, because I'd started to see a lot of stuff on social media, and it kind of came from the stuff about the comedian Garrett something or other, who had mentioned something about crime going up and basically been driven off social media. And yes, thank you for the person saying I should be looking at the camera. I know this setup is suboptimal. We'll have it fixed for the future. And a lot of people have been saying he was wrong, crime had not been going up. They're showing the murder rate in the country and basically saying, there's no impact here. Crime is as it was. So I decided I would actually look into the stats for the last 21 years. And they're right, the number of crimes overall has gone down. But when you look at it, you're seeing massive increases across a number of the categories that actually are going to make your life substantially worse. So harassments, assaults, blackmails, extortions. Murder is down, but attempted murder is up massively. And part of that, when I talked to the guards, was that they were saying that a lot of the murder, or people know, a lot of the murder came from gangland violence. It was assassinations, targeted attacks on drug dealers, people involved in that system. And what they were basically saying was they've successfully stopped a lot of those plots from being successful, which means that you actually are seeing a lot more attempted murders. That's why the murder rate in Ireland is a really bad measure of the general kind of level of violence in society, because we are such a safe country in general, and historically very much so, and because so much is related to gangland violence, then basically you're not actually seeing a reduction in interpersonal violence amongst the public. You're seeing less drug dealers killed. And, you know, people dying is bad, but there's a bit of a difference between a drug dealer being killed over a drug debt and a member of the public being randomly attacked and killed. And so what we saw was just in all of the kind of areas that you would care about, apart from burglary, which has fallen substantially, things have gotten worse. And then when I looked into the CSO runs these things called the crime and victimization surveys. They seem to run them kind of whenever they feel like running them. So they've ran, I think, 5 since 2000. And when I looked into that, you could see that the amount of people who felt they were going to be the victim of crime, who feared crime, was massively up. It was highest in Dublin in nearly every category. It had been highest in Dublin for years, but it seems pretty clear and unambiguous that if you were in Dublin, Dublin has become massively more dangerous. And actually, in relation to one of the comments we had there from John Healy, the increase in sexual assaults all over the country, sexual assaults have gone up massively, hundreds of percent. Rape has gone up massively. Sexual assaults more generally have gone up massively. I've tried to do a good bit of work on this over the past year, and the problem I have is this. When you talk to the guards or the Department of Justice or even some of the NGOs, what they say to you is that it's likely that there are no more sexual assaults in the country than there were historically. And what has gone up is what you call the disclosure rate. So what that basically is, if 100 people have a crime committed on them and 40 of them go to the guards, there's a 40% disclosure rate. So what the guards and the Department of Justice are basically arguing is that there's no real change in the base rate. People have they've begun to trust the guards and the justice system more, and they are coming to them at a greater level. The problem I have with that is every time I've asked the department or the guards what evidence they have for that, they actually don't have any evidence at all. And what I found when I looked into it is there has been no kind of systematic survey of disclosure rates in sexual assaults. So no one knows if the disclosure rate is going up or down, or if the base rate of sexual assaults and rapes is going up or down. And that's probably not a great situation. I mean, it wouldn't be difficult to do. You could do a yearly survey of it, and you could kind of work out from that what's happening. And I don't see why we aren't doing that, other than the fact it might be kind of embarrassing if you did it for a number of crimes and it turned out that a lot of people don't go to the guards. Like the CSO, crime and victims, do anything about that crime. So it might be slightly embarrassing if we had statistics that said a lot of rape victims are not going to the guards because they don't think the guards care about rape. So,
but they've decided to make out like they're just doing a great job anyway, it seems.
Yeah, and then that's basically what they've argued for years. And the language has slightly changed, I think, since I started going to them. They're hedging it a bit more, but basically it's just a vibe. They just think this is what's happening. But then again, you could say the opposite. You could say, well, when you listen to young feminists talk, they talk about how the guards are useless, about how the justice system is just re-victimizing women, and there's no point engaging with it. And maybe that would drive the disclosure rate down. Now, I'm not saying it does, but I'm saying you can make the argument, and it looks like the people in charge of this have basically just decided the argument, which incidentally makes them look good, is what's happening. But they have no evidence behind it. So since the stats aren't created, I can't tell you what's actually happening with it. But when we look at the amount of recorded rapes and sexual assaults, they're up massively, absolutely massively, both in Dublin and across the country as a whole, basically.
And having sat in on, rape trials, it's very hard to imagine that the prospect of having to go through that for a victim would be something that they would feel more encouraged and happy about doing now, because the questioning, the cross-examination is harrowing. And I mean, obviously, it has to be because you're dealing with a situation where the alleged perpetrator is likely to be deprived of their liberty for a substantial amount of time. So you have to be sure. But I just don't know why anyone would be happy-go-lucky about putting themselves through that.
Rape trials are generally horrible for the very simple reason that when a trial for rape is happening, a lot of the time it is basically, he said, she said. Like maybe there's evidence of consensual sex, but the question of whether it was rape is basically the claim of one person against another, maybe with a very mild evidentiary backing. And so if you're defending that, one of the first things you're going to do is destroy the credibility of the woman. And that's just how that's going to happen. And everyone has the right to the zealous advocacy of their legal representatives. So it's hard to see any other way of doing it. And some of the stuff we've seen being suggested to make rape trials easier on the women have actually backfired. So in America, there was a movement for a while to remove the need for the women to come in to testify, that they could testify via video link. And it was argued that this would basically mean that it would be easier on them mentally. That was the list of it. And basically having to face your accuser in a court, or alleged accuser, could victimize them again. The problem was that when they did that, conviction rates went down, because juries trust people in front of them more than they trust people who appear via camera. So a lot of the suggestions for how to fix it are either going to make it worse for the victim, as in lower conviction rates, or worse for the accused, as in eat away at their due process. And it's not an easy one to fix at all, and I don't think it will be fixed at all.
Oh yeah, I mean it's something that I've thought about, and like, you know, the law is the law, and it is it can be quite blunt sometimes in the way it's administered, but yeah, that is one of them. It's a really tricky one, and it's an emotional thing to have to witness somebody on the stand being, having their argument torn apart in a way that's, as you said, like almost completely unavoidable. Well, anyway, speaking of arguments, if I may, I think you had a pretty interesting article about how everyone on the internet is dumb except for except for me or you or whoever the protagonist is.
Yeah, so this is one of those wonderful articles where you put it up and everyone agrees with you, and everyone also believes that it cannot apply to them. So for those who didn't see it, what this was an article I had written on literacy rates. And Ireland is very proud of its literacy rates. We say we have 99%, everyone can read, it's fantastic. And you very rarely hear anything beyond that. But literacy is actually split into 5 different levels, ranging from level 1, where you can basically, you can read a sentence, and if it's very simple and very direct, you can understand it, to level 5, which is reading complex, academic, heavily technical or complicated pieces and pulling information out of it. And level 3 is about what you need to exist without help in a modern society. And when I looked at the stats, I believe the majority of Irish people are around that level or below it. I was basically making the argument that there's no point arguing with people on the internet, because frankly, a lot of the time they don't understand what you're saying. But trying to go from that to the broader argument, which is that we're building a society which is increasingly not designed for people who struggle with that area of life. And that basically we built a society for the top performers, the level 4 and 5 guys, who make up about 9% of the population. And we're increasingly making things more difficult for other people by replacing human interaction with process, and basically creating a very cold world for certain people, because most people don't notice it, because no one really wants to start talking about why certain people have different literacy rates. And some of it is education, and some of it is genetic, it's IQ. And there's a certain amount of the population that you cannot educate above a certain level. And so if you basically say everyone can achieve everything all the time, and it's only education, you're going to push those people out, because they can't get to where you need them to get to. And I think it's kind of a cruel system. So a large part of it actually was about how we should be kinder to each other, and we should actually pay more attention to different capabilities and try and design society around that, rather than this increasingly intellectual, highly literate society, which is just pushing out people who have a lot to offer, are just not particularly good at that area, whether it's education or intelligence.
I remember having this conversation with my mom, a similar conversation where like she was a nurse, since she was 19. And she was saying that, because the leaving cert points for doctors are so very, very high, and it's based on academic achievement, that she felt that there was a gap between the kind of people who have that kind of empathy and instinct towards medicine, who would probably be a phenomenal doctor, who just couldn't make it past the line.
Yeah, I actually had this conversation with a guy called Jimmy Sheehan, and Jimmy Sheehan was the founder of the Blackrock Clinic and the Hermitage, and he's built a number of private hospitals. And I was talking to him about the building of the Children's Hospital years ago, and he was saying it was going to cost at least 2.1 billion euro to finish it. And that, I think at this point they were saying it would cost less than a billion. So kudos to Jimmy for seeing that one coming. But then again, he did build several hospitals, so that helps. But he was actually making that point himself, that he had noticed over his career that as medicine had become higher and higher points and had become more prestigious for a certain type of person, you were drawing in people who he thought were not actually terribly good doctors. They were academically very good, they might be very good in a research setting, but when you put them into a hospital or into a GP's office and they have to deal with the general population, he just thought they had no bedside manner. Now, not all of them, but basically as the points had gone up, that number had increased over time. And yeah, he had made exactly that point, that it was kind of a less pleasant experience for everyone, and that's a big difference in medicine, particularly at the GP level, where a lot of time you're dealing with people who are less interested in you healing them and are oftentimes looking for more reassurance, particularly parents of small children who they just want to know that things are okay. And bedside manner is actually a really big part of that. And if you can't do that, you're performing quite poorly for your patients.
I mean, empathy. I think empathy is a huge part of, if you have you have something wrong with you. Like I had a horrible cold. I think it was a cold. It may not have been a cold, but like the week before last, I was between 38 and 39 degrees for 3 days straight, which was not pleasant. And I didn't end up going to hospital because, like, my mom, as I said, is a nurse. So I thought, look, if I'm dying, she'll probably catch it. But yeah, no, a huge part of being sick is basically having someone to kind of like make you a cup of tea or just, make you a hot water bottle when you're having rigors. And it's not necessarily like you need to take this pill now. It's not a huge part of it is that kind of the human touch, as like Jimmy Sheehan said, kind of getting lost.
One of my more, I think, unpopular ideas is that it would probably save the health service a lot of money if we basically brought a lot of alternative medicine into it. And when you bring that point up, people start saying, but there's no evidence for it, there's no evidentiary basis, it would be a waste of money. But I think when you actually look at how people engage with the health service at the local level, they could actually deal with a lot of it, and probably better than a lot of GPs, because it is the more mental side of things. It is, making people feel they're listened to, making them feel that things are okay, and then you could direct more serious cases to more appropriate medical professionals. But I actually think there's probably a strong argument that it would save a lot of money and that people would actually feel a lot better about it.
When I was living in Japan, actually, it's a thing there that old people, particularly those who live alone, they just go to the GP or the equivalent, like the local hospital, because they have nothing else to do and they're lonely. Like
Mhm.
there's not really anything wrong with them. Like Japanese older people live very, very long, as we know. But it was just like it's a bit of a day out for them. They just go there. And that's obviously putting a burden on the health service, where if there was some kind of other like in between thing, then maybe they'd go to that and free up the GPs.
Yeah, there's a very interesting book called Bowling Alone, which kind of touches on this. It was written about America, and it's about the bowling leagues. And it uses bowling leagues used to be incredibly popular in America. They were all over the place. But it's basically a book about the dissolution of communities and all of the kind of groups that you used to have that people would build links to, and as they got older would be support networks and give them things to do, basically. And the medical side of things tends to massively undervalue friendships and basically those kind of communities. And it was written by a guy called Putnam, and his thesis was that this was going to have all sorts of political and health consequences, because when people are going to groups, whether they're church groups, whether they're hobby groups, whatever they are, it links them to their community and it builds friendships and it keeps people healthy, but it also keeps them kind of sane. It's hard to become really, really strange in certain ways, particularly politically, if you have to meet people commonly. And I think the internet and the breakdown of those kind of communities together has produced some very strange effects.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're there by yourself with YouTube for a couple of days, you can go down some very, very bizarre rabbit holes. Like there are people on the internet who believe every woman in public life is actually transgender or something. Like there are people who legitimately believe that, and it's yeah.
Yeah, that kind of area of belief has gone quite strange. And there's a joke about it where, if you in the 80s you decided you had some weird political view, or even some weird like sexual fetish or something, you probably would have gotten over it because there's no one to talk to about it, and you just kind of move on with your life. Whereas now you can go online, you can find a forum which is totally dedicated to people who are also dedicated to that. And I think a lot of what we've seen, particularly with the trans stuff amongst children, is related to that. Whereas feelings of kind of gender incongruity were actually relatively common amongst young children, but historically you just got older and they dissipated. Whereas now you can go online and you can talk to people who are fixated on it and will push you and pull you in certain directions. And I think you couple that, as I said, with the lack of a kind of a real world community. That's when you start seeing really weird stuff happen.
Yeah, I mean, when I was 12, 11, 12, I certainly did not want to grow up. And if somebody had come to me and said, here's a pill that like a puberty blocker, if somebody had offered me a puberty blocker to like have more time to think, I would have wanted it. And like having grown up now, I love being female. Like I feel very lucky to be. So when I see kids who are being kind of like led down this path of making irreversible medical decisions about their bodies, I do see myself in them because I very easily would have wanted that too. And I don't think it's very rare for a child to be a little bit afraid of growing up and afraid of the things that change, and maybe your parents like, not looking after you as well, and that you're not small anymore. Like growing up is scary for anyone. Even like getting a new job is scary. There's lots of stuff in life that's scary and you don't necessarily want to do in the beginning.
Yeah, and I mean, this sort of thing was presented kind of as, the solution if you don't feel right in your own body. But that's kind of part and parcel of growing up and kind of recognizing different things about your life. My actual main problem with this, and this is a really like technical point, is I really dislike when people say, "I feel I'm not a woman or I'm not a man." For the very simple reason that if you are a man or a woman, any way you feel is that of a man or a woman, because you are a man or a woman. To say you don't feel like the sex you are is meaningless, because you have no idea what anything different than yourself feels like.
Yeah, and it's like basically it's limiting the scope of experiences that can be attributed to a man or a woman. It's like if I like GAA, I must not be a woman then. It's just it's the stupidest thing you've ever heard in my life. And yet there are so many people who are caught up in it, and like in the Irish government essentially just cheerleading it on as if it's completely normal, and it's just absolute madness.
Yeah, I hadn't planned to get into the transgender thing today, although there's no harm in it. So I might move on, but it could be good maybe to bring in Stella or something, Stella O'Malley from Gen Spectre, the like, to actually talk about this in more detail on one of these. I did want to touch on the combination of the Marine Le Pen conviction and the comment by the European Commission having to come out and saying that it was funding environmental NGOs that were unduly, as they said, lobbying. So for those who've been following this, Marine Le Pen has been convicted of embezzlement in a French court. Now, she's been sentenced to a 5-year ban from running for office. This means she's not going to be able to run for the presidency in 2027. Now, she can appeal that, and if she gets that done in 2026, and she'll be okay. But French courts can move quite slowly on this. So the expectation is that Marine Le Pen will be blocked from running for president in the next French presidential election. The problem there is that Marine Le Pen was polling. France has a runoff system where you basically run twice. So she is polling as she was likely to come first in the first round, and then with a good chance of winning. Now, French courts have done this before. Nicolas Sarkozy, for instance, was banned. And there have been a couple of other kind of high-profile ones. So this is not something that has just been targeted at Le Pen. What is different about this is that when Sarkozy was hit by it, he'd already left politics. So you usually don't see anyone this major, and particularly not with the expectation was this person could win the presidency, that their party is in the ascendancy and may keep going, and basically stopping a political movement dead in its tracks. I should also point out that this is different than what we saw in Romania, where something very similar happened and the front runner was banned from running There, what had happened was there was a unproven allegation of Russian state intervention, and basically they used that to knock this guy out, and to invalidate the first round of the presidential run, and then to knock him out from running again. There was never any evidence that was presented there that actually looked terribly compelling. In this case, it looks like, yeah, Le Pen did what is alleged did actually happen. And what is alleged is basically that they took money from the EU to pay for staff for MEPs and people of that nature, and instead put them onto party affairs, national politics, basically. And Le Pen and her people didn't really deny that. They instead tried to use a defense where they said this shouldn't it shouldn't be considered a problem, basically, that their party staff working for the party, what they do is up to us, and the court basically found against that. And so she will likely not be able to run. Now, she has a young protege, Radella, who could run in her place, and he might do quite well, but he is not considered as much of a heavyweight as Le Pen. He's not considered as serious a politician. He's very young. He's only 29. So this might be the death of Le Pen's party's presidential ambitions, basically. Yeah, Lagarde as well. One of the comments there. Lagarde was also found guilty. I'm not sure if that was of corruption, though. It was a slightly different one. But there have been a number of French politicians found guilty of this kind of offence and subsequently barred. But it's unusual that it would be at this stage of a politician's career. She will appeal this. I mean, even Sarkozy is still appealing his corruption case. I think the prosecution is pushing for something like 7 years if he's found guilty. So it's not an unusual. It's an unusual thing in France, but it's not unheard of. The problem, I think, is the political side of this. It looks quite bad. As I said, Le Pen is in the ascendancy. The expectation was she was going to do very well. The National Rally is doing extremely well. The cordon sanitaire that was kind of there traditionally in France has sort of broken down. And so this coming at this point immediately makes people think, well, this is political, or this has some political dimension to it. Now, in relation to the courts, the French courts were kind of locked into what they could do there. Once they found her guilty, this was kind of the default thing, that she would be found ineligible for the next presidential run. Whether or not a court should have that power, I think, is an entirely different question. I don't think a court should have that power to begin with. I think it's up to the public. I mean, once she was found guilty of this, it's up to the public to decide whether or not they care about that and then vote for or vote against her as they will. I think a court actually doing this is a breach of the separation of power. But then I would say France is not a common law country. It runs on the Napoleonic Code, and their legal systems basically run extremely difficult. What has made this slightly more awkward for the opposing side has been the revelation yesterday that the European Commission was funding lobbying and advocacy work in a way it shouldn't have been, very clearly, particularly with relation to environmental NGOs. Now, this came about because the EPP and the ECR, particularly in the European Parliament, basically figured out this was happening and started to push for this to end, and the Commission had to come out and admit, yes, we were funding NGOs who were lobbying politicians, they were doing advocacy work, they were doing all these things, and they shouldn't have been. Now, they've admitted it, and they've said they've changed it so it won't happen in the future, but they haven't named the NGOs, they haven't said exactly what was done, they haven't said exactly how much money was spent on this. The program that they accept was used to fund some of this work has a valuation of over 5 billion euro. So you could have seen quite a lot of money being spent by this. And the basic gist of it was that environmental NGOs were lobbying politicians to push things that the Commission wanted done. Environmental movements that the Commission wanted done. And it seems like it is clearly an absolutely improper use of funds. The problem now is that you have on one side the Romanian issues, you have Le Pen being removed, you have all of the pushbacks against Orban in Hungary, you had some of the I mean, it's stopped now because Tusk is in power, but before Tusk came to power, there were talks about things that could be done to legally hurt Poland. And then on the other hand, it turns out, oh, by the way, this entire time we were funding NGOs to push our things through public funding in a way that is, as they said, undue. And it's just not a great look altogether.
But I wonder what could happen. What is there a responsibility there? Because I just the thing that Le Pen was found guilty on. I would wonder how widespread that is, and I would somehow, I would, yeah, really doubt that she was the only one doing it. Which does, kind of make it really look like it's politically motivated. And then, in terms of the hypocrisy, really, of the EU higher ups, like, what's going to happen there? Is it like, was it one rule for them and another rule for everyone, or are people going to do something about it? It's just there's a lot of questions, I think.
I think the expectation will be that nothing will happen at the Commission level. That they will basically say, well, mistakes were made, shouldn't have happened, won't happen again, and no harm done, and they'll move on. That's generally how the Commission works these things. In relation to Le Pen and how common this is extremely common. Basically, this would be the same as if an Irish MEP took on a member of staff for their European work and then put them back in their constituency, handling constituency affairs. Now, to say that happens commonly is an understatement. It happens constantly across Europe. The thing that Le Pen did is she kind of took the piss with it. So they were able to find texts to Le Pen from people who were meant to be working from MEPs, asking to be introduced to the MEPs that they worked for about a year into their job. And at that point, it became kind of difficult. So it's not so much that Le Pen did it and no one else is doing it. It's that they did it. I would say there was a political motive in making it known that they did it so that this court case could happen. But also they did themselves absolutely no favors. They could have done this the way it's normally done, as in the way it's done in Ireland, where you spend 5% of your time on European work and 95% of your time in the constituency, and it's just kind of allowed to happen. So Le Pen did herself no favors there, particularly those texts. And it kind of amazes me as someone who's done some work in this area. People really need to learn that certain conversations are phone calls, not texts. Like, you don't incriminate yourself in activity in written form.
It's not a great idea, and you would think that, when the stakes are so high, that there might be a level of awareness of that, but I guess maybe there's not.
And it's strange because at the European level, like, there's a lot of pressure on not just Le Pen or the Hungarians, but let's say like the entire ECR grouping, anything that's outside the kind of EPP socialist green split. They know there's a lot of focus on them, and there are auditors and there's people looking at it. And yeah, some of it is nakedly political, but that. And kind of the first rule of politics is do not make mistakes you don't need to make. And so in this, is it fair? I would say no. Should it happen? I would say no. A court shouldn't have this power to do it. Where they kind of, do things they shouldn't have in ways they shouldn't have. Yeah, pretty clearly. Whereas in Romania, it was basically just like a court going, yeah, we just don't want to deal with this.
But it does start to sound like the EU is not particularly fond of the whole like democratic process when they're they're sorry, I'm still a little bit under the weather, but they seem to have this default practice of wanting to ban people rather than win in a fair fight, which is the entire point of democracy.
Yeah, and I mean the democracy point is a good one. Actually, I'll just throw a comment there from someone that Ireland has no party or independent TD to represent the majority of actual Irish people, and that I think is one of the problems that you've seen here, and you see it with the ADF in Germany. The idea of the cordon sanitaire, there are parties you won't deal with. And I spoke about this in relation to Sinn Féin in Ireland, I think, quite a lot. Sinn Féin, and well, the IRA more exactly, were told, if you lay down arms and get involved in politics, you will be allowed into the political system. And that was the deal that they were basically given. And now you find yourself in a situation where none of the major parties will go in with Sinn Féin. And on one level, parties have the right to decide who they're doing. But as Sinn Féin becomes larger and larger and more people vote for it, you're basically saying a lot of people, their votes don't matter anymore. That you're not going to take into account what they want because you hold so much of the electorate between those parties that it doesn't matter if 30 or 40% agree with a different position. They're just going to have to eat it. And I think that is extremely, it's extremely bad for democracy, because you're basically invalidating a lot of people's views. But also it makes it more and more difficult to form a government. Like, you look at the German government at the minute, because they won't touch the ADF or the AfD. It's kind of becoming a shambles. You kind of need everyone else from, the left to the right to just have any semblance of a thing. And it's going to get worse. And where we have seen, parties accept, okay, you need to deal with these parties when they're popular, we've actually seen kind of politics work a bit better. Like in some of the Nordic countries, their approach to immigration became much more hardline, and that actually put down a lot of the temperature of a lot of this stuff, because they were doing what the people wanted. But when we're talking about democratic deficits, people becoming more radicalized, people trusting the government less, well, if you're basically saying we don't care what you vote and we don't care what you think, and you do it for a decade, you can't really be surprised when people don't like you, trust you, or think you're doing what's good for them.
Yeah, I wonder, is the problem a little bit more deeply entrenched in Ireland, where, you mentioned Sinn Féin, but I think Sinn Féin has very, very much departed from a lot of the ideas of republicanism, like, especially like, nationalist sentiments. I don't think that there is a party in government at the moment at all that would cater to the wants or the needs of people, like those down in Carna, for example. Like, my own grandmother was from Connemara, and it's such a special place, that whole Gaeltacht area, and all the Gaeltacht areas are such incredibly special places. And to see how there is such a lack of basic respect from the current administration and the previous one for what those places mean to a country who had the language beaten out of us, our own sovereignty just completely erased for hundreds of years. And those places are so precious. They're like time capsules. And now the government doesn't give a damn, it seems, about potentially destroying them.
I fall back on the old quip that you should never attribute to malice what can be explained by sheer incompetence. My personal view of this is that the current parliament is the lowest quality parliament in my life, and not by a small margin.
You said that about the previous one as well. So this one is worse then.
It's been true for about a decade. I mean, if you look back at, a Haughey, a Hearn, Gareth Fitzgerald, basically from, the early 2000s back, whether or not you liked those parliaments, whether or not you thought they did good things, there was a level of competency there that I don't think is there anymore. Like, it's just entirely different now. And I'm not entirely sure why that's happened, but actually I think I would probably blame a lot of it on our corporate tax rate. I think because we bring in so much money through corporate tax rate, politicians are insulated from bad decisions. Whereas when we were building up to that in the 80s and the 90s, and even in some of the early 2000s, if you were doing badly, you knew you were doing badly because the country would do badly. Whereas now, the corporate tax rate is so large, you can do things which are horrific and damaging, but you make more money. So economically, it looks like you're actually doing okay. But I think you can see that in some of the way we now treat like the SME sector. Like, they're absolutely unimportant, dirt on the shoe kind of thing. And I think that's just led to an overall reduction in competency. And eventually, it's going to come back to bite us, and it's going to be really bad. And if Trump and his tariffs kind of go that direction, then it's going to be one of the things actually on the tariffs I haven't heard really discussed, but I think is actually probably the major threat of them if they keep going on, is not the immediate threat to jobs. It's that Trump will use them to convince governments to transfer their IP back to America. And I'm not sure how many people know that, but what's happened is that American companies have set up in Ireland and basically sold their own IP to their Irish subsidiaries. And then they make, because they own the IP in Ireland, they make a percentage on every phone or every technological device that is sold. And it all comes back to Ireland, and then it's taxed at our tax rate rather than the American tax rate. And the Americans know this. They know it's basically it's not a scam because it's legal, but they would very much rather it wasn't. So I think that may be why they're using some of these tariffs, to basically just try and get companies to do that and do it that way. And if that happens, the Irish government finances will collapse. just absolutely collapse. It's not a risk factor I've heard really talked about, but that would be where I'd be more concerned than jobs and kind of the short to medium term. Because if you want to move a pharmaceutical factory back to North America, it's going to take you years. Like, they're extremely technical to rebuild, whereas something like that, you could do that overnight. With sufficiently good legal team, you could get that done nearly instantly.
When you say collapse, like, what do you mean? What does that mean, on a kind of, tax and bolts level?
So it's actually kind of difficult to work out, because we know that Irish corporate tax rates have grown massively year on year, and that they are now effectively a central plank of the government's budget. But we don't know within that which companies are contributing exactly how much. We have kind of a broad idea of which the largest ones are, like Apple, Microsoft, people like that. But we don't know exactly who is where or what sectors they're in. But if you think about it, we have a crippling deficit already that we're basically trying to get past. If you were to take out 10% of the Irish budget, it would be done. We cannot sustain our current spending at the level they're at without that. And I think the problem you'd have there is then this government would have to go, okay, how can we cut our budget by 10%? And that'll just be a disaster, a fiasco. They're not good enough to handle something like that.
They are spending a whole rake of taxpayers' money on useless crap, as we know.
But that's the thing. If you're getting in money, there's a general saying that people, they care about what they've worked for. If you give someone free money, they are much less careful with it than if they've worked for that money. And the Irish governments for the last 20 years, 15 years at least, have not worked for that money. It's been free. So why not spend it on stupid crap? You didn't do anything to get it. It was done by people who came before you, and you just kind of maintain it. And so I don't have any great faith that they would be able to handle that kind of level of disruption. And then if you actually do see job losses in the multinational sector, it won't just be the immediate job losses. If you have a town, like let's say Leakslip. So there are rumors that Intel might be acquired by a different company because their share price has collapsed. Now, if that happens, Leakslip might be considered perhaps uneconomical, and they'd close it. And if they did that, you wouldn't just lose the immediate jobs, you'd kill the town. Because everyone who's employed there also employs other service. They go to the barber, they go to local shops, they go to pubs. You lose all of that. So a heavy enough hit to the multinational sector that impacts on jobs would just devastate entire swathes of the country. It would knock out nearly all local employment.
I think even on a more micro level, I was reading a piece I really enjoyed in Unheard yesterday. It was about Karna and the situation down there. And one of the people that was interviewed in it was saying that he had grown up in the area when it was like a booming fishing village. And, the kind of the EU, Ireland's turn towards a more like EU driven economy basically decimate that industry is now gone,
Yeah, and fisheries are one of those areas where I think Irish politicians have generally been deeply dishonest to the people involved. And there's very much a sort of Europe did this to us. That's not what happened. Ireland traded away those rights, many of them, because we thought it wasn't important and we wanted to basically get concessions in relation to agriculture. And now we've gone back, and part of it is now saying, oh, we shouldn't have done that. But we did, and no one wants to accept what is happening to those communities was done deliberately, because we actually just compared a different community and thought they get support, you don't, and you're just going to get screwed. And no politician wants to go down and just go, yeah, we made that decision. No one forced us to do it. We couldn't negotiate it, but we decided you weren't worth the effort. And this is the inevitable outcome of that.
What do they expect those people to do? Like, people living in rural parts of Ireland can't all work in pharmaceutical plants. It just sounds incredibly disrespectful and just irresponsible. Well,
that's the thing. Depending on where you live, there may not be anything that you can do, and you basically hollow out entire sectors of it. And it's kind of the problem with globalization. When people run the numbers and they say, well, increased globalization makes people better off by driving down prices of certain goods and increasing GDP. So the thing there is that if that's correct, the gains of globalization are spread out across the entire population. But if there are certain people who take the negatives of that because they're now not competitive, and you keep hitting them over and over, yeah, everyone else can get a TV for €50 cheaper. And then you go, oh, by the way, this entire region, there's just no jobs now. And that was the trade-off. And we just didn't tell you that was going to happen, but we knew it was going to happen.
It sounds like the attitude that we were discussing earlier with medicine, where it's like, these people who are really bright on paper but don't have the empathy. It just sounds like that happening on a more kind of economic level.
Yeah, and I mean, look, sometimes some industries are just not going to work. They used to work and they've gotten to the end of it. And there's certain, like during the Thatcher years, for instance, you could say, the miners, was that sustainable? Like it was a basket case. It was massively losing money. They kept it alive longer than they should have. And you do get a certain thing in government of just, well, it's going to die anyway. So why bother? The problem I think we've seen is that no one wants to tell communities that. No one wants to be upfront with them. And oftentimes there's not really any drive there to see, well, if we did different things, could actually this industry survive? Could we change it in certain ways and it would continue or might even thrive? And oftentimes, because we don't accept there are going to be losers of globalization, I think you end up basically like Irish fishermen, and you're going to be screwed.
I think the hospitality sector is kind of experiencing a new and unprecedented boom by going asylum accommodation center. I mean, there seems to be making millionaires overnight. It's a fantastic cash cow.
It's fantastic cash cow for certain people. But I think, again, you run into that sort of problem. It's not just the people who are immediately impacted. If you have a rural village that has, let's say, a well-known hotel, and every year, however many people go to the hotel, the village is probably dependent on the money of those of those tourists. If you turn that to asylum accommodation, you'll probably kill the village.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, even talking to people who own restaurants, like Paul Trevode is a really outspoken person. The asylum seekers who come into the town, they don't go and have dinner on a Saturday evening. Like they're not going having pints in the evening. They're not going like spending money on fancy lattes. And the things that is the lifeblood of a local economy. Like even, transient workers coming into a town where there's seasonal work have nowhere to stay because the one or two local places that were available have now gone asylum. And there's just nothing. Like it is just completely no thought whatsoever into the impact this policy has on the people who live here permanently. Like no thought whatsoever. Like not a care seems to have been given.
Now, I just wanted to pull up a comment there from Taffin Returns saying we wouldn't have the good standing we have now without the EU and the USA. I think that is actually an important point here. Like being in the EU helped us economically massively. But I think the problem is we don't admit there are trade-offs in certain ways. And that I think is actually the issue. Like certain sectors were negotiated against because we thought they weren't important. That didn't have to be the case. Now, whether or not that on the balance of efficiency was the right thing to do, I think the problem is in a democracy, politicians don't want to go down and actually explain, yeah, we did this and it's going to be better off for everyone except you. You're getting screwed and your children are probably going to get screwed unless you leave this region entirely or you find some new way to get employed. But the other side of that argument is that, yeah, but the country itself got raised so much money from doing so, basically that was a necessary sacrifice. I think the problem is that it's usually a sacrifice made by people who have no control over it, and usually without being told, oh, by the way, you are being sacrificed, and we're not going to tell you, so you're going to keep working at this, but it's never going to work, and we know it's not going to work. And, you'll probably go out of business in 10 years.
It's cruel. I mean, you mentioned SMEs before, and just even if you walk around Dublin now, there's basically a Starbucks on every second corner, and there's absolutely nothing kind of unique or Irish about that at all. It's so bland, Like I remember just coming home from South Korea and just looking around, being like, "Where's all the Irish businesses?" It's like it seems like the only Irish owned, not the only, but like the major Irish owned businesses now are all pubs. Like there might be Murphy's or Keogh's or O'Donoghue's, and like everything else is basically Costa, Starbucks, Insomnia. I think one of them might be Irish, but you get my point.
Yeah, there's a thing in economics called Dutch disease. It comes from the Dutch experience, where, and I think it relates to Ireland. In relation to the Dutch, it referred to where you find a natural resource, and it basically draws all of the economy to it, and it makes everything more expensive for other parts of the economy. But it also draws in a lot of the best educated people, a lot of the people who would otherwise maybe have set up their own businesses or things like that. I think you can make a strong argument that in Ireland, the multinationals have effectively caused Dutch disease, and our economy has become extremely expensive. And a lot of our best people are pulled into the multinationals, and that means they're pulled away from creating businesses. They make indigenous business costs more expensive. It's had a whole host of impacts on the economy that we don't really go into. But when you talk to people privately about it, whether in the Department of Finance or wherever, they'll say, yeah, that's probably happening. And then you generally get, but it was worth it for the benefits we got. And my problem there is I'm not disagreeing with them as such. I'm saying you don't really have a full and frank accounting of the benefits and the costs.
Yeah, I mean, there's something disappointing about spending like $1,000 on a flight to go somewhere like Seoul or whatever, South Korea, and then the first thing you see coming out of the airport is a Starbucks. It's like, okay. And it's the same Starbucks, they have the same kind of furniture, the same kind of colors, they play the same kind of playlists, and I just think we could be doing so much better. Like Ireland has such a unique and really famous culture worldwide. I think most people, maybe not most, maybe I'm self-aggrandizing there, but if you see somebody with a shamrock, like a little shamrock keyring on their bag or whatever, I think a lot of people know where that's from. And I think Ireland is one of the few countries where we have an immediately like recognizable symbolism. And
Mhm.
it's a great asset, which we're just not like maximizing at all. And in fact, as I said, it seems like we're completely just ruining it. We're ruining it for ourselves, we're ruining it for the people who would want to come here and spend lots of money. It's just, yeah, it just sucks.
Yeah, one of the things I've been saying for a couple of years that I think we're really bad at is actually anything involving the diaspora, basically
Mhm.
people of Irish heritage abroad, of which there are God knows how many millions. It's something that the Israelis actually do very well, whatever else one thinks of them elsewise. They have programs like the Birthright programs that are entirely about bringing people to Israel to kind of connect them to it, the diaspora. That's one of the reasons they have such strong links with the diaspora. And for years, I've been saying Ireland should have something similar. We should have a program where we bring Irish Americans or Americans forever over to Ireland at all kind of different levels. And we should be using that and doing things like that to, one, build up the view of America abroad, because that's good for exports, that's good for outward investment, but also to convince people to come here and set up businesses and do things of that nature. And there's just no real interest in it. But
Mm.
actually, we have gone, I think, fairly substantially over time with this episode, Fatima. So I think we may need to close it up there. Thank you for everyone who has listened and commented. If you have any thoughts on this that you want to send over, please email me at gary@gript.ie. We will be back next week. It should be myself and Fatima. And depending on the stories, we might bring in John or Ben or someone to discuss particular stories. But we hope it's been a good use of your time. All the best.
Thanks, everyone.